Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Death Note Part 1, Episode 18, Ally. The episode in a nutshell is just a brief reminder of what happens within this episode. So this episode begins by showing us the upgraded security on the new headquarters that L had built from scratch, which includes Aizawa driving into it, having to give his fingerprints, other identification, then go through metal detectors. Basically, he ends up coming into the task force in his underwear because he does not know how to pass the security any other way because it is so high tech and so extreme. In it, when he gets in, he asks what they ask him why he has a bandage on his forehead, and he comments that he and his spouse have been fighting over how much time he's been spending on the task force. And one of the final straws was there was the option to live in the new headquarters, but he's basically having to commute because his spouse is unhappy with all the time that he's been away. He then asks where Elle and Light are, and he's informed that they are on a date with Misa, and we see on the screen the video of said date, and then we move into where the date is, where Misa is complaining that Elle's there, and he points out the fact that even if he wasn't there, he'd still be watching through the camera, so she's never actually going to get any alone time with Light. He then asks her if she's going to finish her cake, as he's already finished his. She comments on how she'd get fat if she ate it, so he then decides that he can take it. It then moves on to Light and Elle talking about the Kira case, and Elle expressing his disappointment that Light doesn't seem to be Kira anymore because he was so sure that he was one, and that Misa was the second Kira, and how he's feeling unmotivated and disappointed now that it's looking like Light, at the very least, doesn't remember being Kira and therefore can't really be held accountable for Kira's actions at this particular moment. And Light gets frustrated enough with him that he punches him. And Elle doesn't take that sitting down and retaliates, and they end up fighting. The task force watches this on the screen and decides they need to stop the fight somehow. So Matsuda then calls the phone in Misa's room, and Elle picks it up, which it does end up stopping the fight. But then Matsuda basically goes on about some of the upcoming events scheduled for Misa as her manager, and Light puts it down, or Elle puts the phone down and basically comments on Matsuda being an idiot, and Light agreeing with him, and that does end the fight. We then get some more daily tasks in the task force where Light discovers a pattern that several of the recent deaths are businessmen, not necessarily criminals, and that each and every one of these businessmen deaths helps the stock price of Yotsuba Group, which then changes the direction of the task force investigation towards Yotsuba Group. And of course, Elle considers this to be a third Kira, whose priority isn't the criminals, but the actual business side of things. And this, of course, is happening 2 months later. So once we get the fight, it then does a time skip of 2 months, and that's when this clue is found. Soichiro then has a meeting with his boss, essentially, who tells him that Kira has offered bribes to politicians, that if they no longer pursue Kira, he will not kill any politicians. And they've accepted this bribe, which leads to Soichiro and Mogi handing in their resignation and heading back to the headquarters, where they then tell Aizawa and Matsuda that if they're going to continue the investigation, they should quit too. Elle tests them by basically saying, if you quit you shouldn't quit the police. I was fine investigating on my own. I can continue to do that without you. Blah, blah, blah. It's going to be financially detrimental, blah, blah, blah. And then Watari kind of butts in and basically reveals that Elle had set aside funds for each of them should they be fired due to working on the task force, or should they lose their lives on the task force. It would ensure that their families would be well taken care of for the rest of their lives and not be negatively impacted. Aizawa, upon hearing this, instead of being grateful, becomes angry that he was being tested, decides that he really hated Elle, and quits the task force, ending up on a park bench where his wife and daughter happen to come by with a son in the carriage. And essentially, she's still kind of angry, noting that she didn't get enough groceries to make dinner for him, just her and the kids. And he then tells them that he's going to have more time off now to be able to take his daughter to the park and the zoo and other locations before he breaks down crying. And then back with the task force, we have Wedi and Iber being introduced to the task force. Iber is a con man who's going to help them out, and Wedi is a known thief who is going to be helping them out. And at first, obviously, Suichiro, being the police officer, is a bit worried about that, but ultimately decides that for a case like this, their skills would in fact be handy to have, and that is where we end this episode. Bringing us to my favorite part, which is the ranking of the episode. As always, we will rank on our two lists, the mostly objective ranking list, where we're using set values to determine the score, and then the personal ranking list, which is my personal opinion. So as always, we are going to start with our positive side of the chart, and I've highlighted those I felt applied. First, of course, we have our single arc supporting character introductions, which is the introduction of Wedi and Iber, and they are worth 1 point each as they are single arc supporting characters. Then we have worth 3 points our multi-arc supporting character development, where we learn that Aizawa has been married, but is having marital problems due to his work on the task force. And then also the task force is asked to resign in order to continue on the task force, as the police have officially accepted the bribes at their and will no longer be officially investigating. So if they want to continue to be part of the investigation, they would need to do so as no longer being police officers of Japan, essentially. And then, worth another 3 points, we have our impactful slash memorable moment lines, etc. And that's the handcuff fight, which is very impactful and memorable. And also, I know not everybody reads fanfiction. I am a big fanfiction reader, however, and one of the ways that I determine whether or not something has been very impactful to a fandom is how often I see that scene used in fan fiction when people are using it, because there are certain scenes that just stand out and happen to show up in most fan fictions written about a particular series. And this handcuff fight is one that is extremely popular to be used in fan fiction, therefore you know that it has impacted the fandom pretty strongly, because if it didn't, they wouldn't be using it in a very large number of those fan fictions. So, and not to mention that it's just very memorable because it does stick in your mind as one of those moments that you do remember from the series, even if like a lot of it blurs into the background over time. It's one of those ones that tends to pop up in your mind when you look back on the series. So, not only is it impactful, I feel like it also ends up being memorable. And then our final positive is worth 4 points, and that is the world building aspect of our mega security new headquarters that we are in seeing for the first time. We found out about the headquarters in the previous episode. This episode, we actually are in that headquarters. We see how it is set up, how it looks nicely high tech, how there's this major security there, how Watari has his own sort of surveillance room for the headquarters, while all of the screens that Elle's working on are more so for the case, how there are residences built into it, so Misa has her own room that she's now living in. Obviously, Light and Elle will have their room, and Matsuda has also indicated that he is living at headquarters. Suichiro, he notes that his situation is different from Aizawa's, which is true. His son is obviously included in the headquarters and such, but it doesn't specify whether he is full-time living there, nor does it really indicate Mogi. We know Aizawa is not full-time there, but would be commuting. However, then he does quit before this episode is done. But the option to live at headquarters exists. So we get to learn a lot more about this new headquarters that they are in. And then that brings us to 12 for this episode. However, there is a negative, obviously negative messaging or behavior. The fight may be impactful, memorable, and a little bit more on the comedic side because they're chained together, so every time they hit each other, they end up going flying themselves too because they get pulled by the momentum. It is still a fight, and violence never the answer. So, negative messaging or behavior. And that is worth -2 points. And then kind of an honorable mention in the same vein, I mentioned how Aizawa had a bandage on his forehead, which he indicated he got due to fighting with his spouse. Obviously, if an injury has occurred which requires a bandage, that then implies that there may have been some violence on that domestic side of things as well with Aizawa. However, that is not confirmed. It is implied because of the wound and the context that he provides for that wound, but as it is not confirmed, only implied, and at the end of the episode, he and his family seem to be having a reconciliation of sorts. I'm not taking points for it. I'm just honorably mentioning that that is kind of implied as a theme, which is also very negative as far as messaging is concerned. And that brings us down to 10, which does make this episode a 10 out of 10 objectively. Which brings our part 1 ranking so far for our mostly objective ranking to, in first place, Rebirth, Confrontation, Doubt, Wager, Decision, Execution, and then Ally is in 7th. It is in 7th because on our objective list, when more than one episode has the same number score, it's put on the list in episode order, and this is the 7th 10 out of 10. Then we move on to in 8th Encounter, Confessions, Tactics, Friend, Pursuit, Glare, Unraveling, Love, Dealings, then Assault, and Overcast currently is in last place. So now we come to my personal ranking, and most of what I have to say already has been said in the mostly objective ranking, but there were a couple of points that I noted that didn't really fit into the chart that I'll bring up now. So the first one, of course, is that I found it highly amusing how Light and Misa are supposedly on this date, and yet the only one who seems to be leading the interactions or actively interacting with either of them is Elle. So first he's the one who interacts with Misa while Light just kind of sits there looking bored about the cake that she's eating and he wants to eat cake too. Or rather he's already eaten his cake and he wants to eat hers too, and she lets him have it. And then he and Light kind of go off into their own little world talking about the case and their progress so far and things like that. While Misa sits there looking bored, and then we have the fight between him and Elle, which again, Misa kind of freaks out about, but isn't actually a part of. So I just found that hilarious how it's supposed to be Misa and Light's date, but Elle's the one who's doing all the talking, all the interacting with each of them separately. And then I also found it funny how, okay, so I have mentioned fan fiction before on the channel, and I do watch a lot of it. Now, it comes as no surprise to anybody that I do not like Misa as a character. Therefore, a lot of times when I am looking up fan fiction, I cut out Misa as a character. Like you can filter the sites that I use, at least you can filter characters you don't want to see in the fan fiction, and it'll cut out any fan fiction where they're tagged as any sort of main character. And so I often, when looking for fan fiction for Death Note, will exclude ones that include Misa because I don't like her as a character. So if I'm recreationally looking up a fan fiction, I'm not going to want to read one about her. Sorry, not sorry. And that then kind of skews me over to a different type of content that often is very light and L centered and focused. And episodes like this one with the handcuff fight, the previous episode where they became handcuffed, this episode where they're having the handcuff fight, where it's implied that they're living at headquarters. Obviously, if they're continually chained, there's that time skip where there's 2 whole months where they've supposedly been completely chained together. It's fodder for a lot of fan fiction. And I just found it absolutely hilarious going from a mindset of things that are used in fan fiction frequently to a place where I'm surprised that nobody has ever used this particular thing in any of the fan fiction that I've read. Because in this episode, Elle, while they're having a conversation about everybody quitting the task force and quitting the police officially and becoming more civilian investigators under Elle's employment, Elle is eating cherries and he keeps tying the stems together with his mouth, which almost every single time you see that in media, in like other shows and such, is usually considered an indicator of being skilled at kissing. That you can tie a cherry stem with your mouth. And it's shocking to me because they have that right there in the canon. And yet, like, nobody ever seems to actually use that in the fan fiction. And usually, a lot of fan fiction draws from canon to give itself support. Almost like, look, I'm right in this theory that I'm writing a fan fiction about because look at this scene happened, and this scene happened, and this scene happened. So it is shocking to me that I've never actually read a fan fiction where that scene in particular was used because you would think that'd be something that they would bring up, especially because I have seen Elle's love of sweets brought up so often. But they'll usually have like a spoon or a lollipop or something like that. And it's like the cherry thing, though, is actually there in canon. Like, why would they not include that? That's kind of an aside, though. Doesn't, well, it does kind of impact the story because I personally found it very amusing, and this is my personal score. But I mean, it's not so impacting that is just something that I wanted to bring up because if anybody else reads fan fiction, which I know not everybody does, but for people who do, my personal favorite fan fictions are those that use canon to basically prove a point that's not canon or that implies their point could be canon had it been a different genre of TV of series. So, anyways, wanted to bring that up. And with that, I have to say, really enjoyed the episode, but also there wasn't a lot that went forward. The only real investigative moving forward with the task force type thing that we got was the oats of a clue being discovered and the police taking bribes and therefore them quitting. But otherwise, it was more like a slice of life of how the task force lives, especially between Light and L. And for that reason, I very much enjoyed it and gave it an 8 out of 10. Which brings our part 1 ranking so far to in first place, Rebirth, then Encounter, Glare, Execution, then we have Confessions, Doubt, Pursuit. This episode comes in 8th, Ally, then Decision, Confrontation, Tactics, Dealings, Friend, Love, Overcast, Wager, followed by Unraveling, and in last place so far, Assault. And then at last we now come to our final segment, which is our series ranking so far, where we'll be ranking each of the parts against each other. And our mostly objective ranking so far for part 1 has earned a total of 140 out of a possible 260 points. And on the personal side, we have earned 111 points out of a possible 260 so far. With that, we've now rewatched and ranked Death Note Part 1, Episode 18, Ally. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.